What if the town you trusted turned against you, and then came back begging for your help? This is the story of Marcus Bennett, a doctor who moves his family to the small town of Riverbend, hoping for a fresh start. But when he's wrongfully accused of a crime, Jack Holden, the town's prosecutor, sends him to prison, tearing Marcus away from his wife Rachel and their children. Rachel fights tirelessly to prove Marcus's innocence, but as the town turns its back on them, hope seems to slip further away. Years later, Jack uncovers new evidence and begins to doubt his actions, realizing he may have made a terrible mistake. But is it too late to right the wrongs he caused? And what will happen when Marcus returns to a town that once branded him a criminal? Will Marcus and Jack find a way to move forward, or will the past haunt them both forever? Comment below if you've ever faced an unfair challenge, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and hope. You won't believe how this story ends. Dr. Marcus Bennett's hands tightened on the steering wheel as their SUV rolled past the "Welcome to Riverbend" sign, the gold-painted letters glinting in the late afternoon sun. Beside him, his wife Rachel gazed out at the small, picturesque town that spread before them, her face reflecting a mix of hope and anxiety. The children, Sarah and Ethan, were practically glued to the backseat windows, their voices bubbling with excitement. "It's so pretty here, Daddy," Sarah exclaimed, her hazel eyes wide as they passed a row of quaint brick buildings adorned with painted wooden signs. "Yeah, way cooler than the city," Ethan added, pressing his nose to the glass to get a better look at the town square, where a white gazebo stood surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges. Marcus forced a smile, his heart swelling with a tentative sense of relief. "It sure is, sweetheart. This is our new home." He glanced at Rachel, who managed a hopeful smile in return. "I think this is going to be good for us," she said quietly, her fingers brushing his on the center console. Marcus nodded, letting her optimism bolster his own. They had left behind a hectic life in Chicago, hoping to find peace and community in this small town. He was determined to make a fresh start here, to build a new life for his family, one free of the stress and tension that had driven him away from his last hospital job. But as they rolled down Main Street, Marcus couldn't ignore the sidelong glances from townspeople. At a crosswalk, an older man in a worn flannel shirt paused mid-stride, his eyes lingering on their car before looking away quickly. A woman walking her dog stopped to watch them pass, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand. "They're just curious," she said as if reading his mind. "New faces in a small town." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, but he couldn't shake the knot in his stomach. Their new home stood at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street, a two-story white house with a wraparound porch. Sarah and Ethan tumbled out of the car as soon as it stopped in the gravel driveway, racing toward the backyard. "There's a tire swing!" Ethan shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees. Marcus smiled as he helped Rachel unload boxes from the car. The house had been everything they dreamed of: plenty of space, a yard for the kids, and a community that seemed, on paper, like a perfect fit for them. Yet as he carried the last box to the porch, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A shadow passed over him, and he turned to see an elderly couple walking slowly down the sidewalk, their gaze fixed on the Bennett's new home. The woman, short and wiry, with curly white hair, nudged her husband before offering a thin smile. "Afternoon," Marcus called out, raising a hand. "We're the Bennetts. Just moved in today." The woman hesitated, then stepped forward with her husband trailing behind. "Welcome to Riverbend. I'm Evelyn, and this is George. We live just down the way." Her smile was polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's nice to meet you," Rachel said, stepping up beside Marcus. "We're looking forward to getting to know everyone." Evelyn nodded, her smile tightening. "It's a quiet town, very close-knit. I'm sure you'll find your way." George muttered something under his breath, and they continued on their way. Marcus watched them go, the tightness in his chest returning. Rachel's hand brushed his arm. "It'll get better, Marcus. People just need time." He nodded, but deep down, unease lingered. The next morning, Marcus walked through the sliding doors of Riverbend General Hospital, adjusting the crisp collar of his white coat. He took a deep breath, letting the sterile, antiseptic-scented air fill his lungs. This was it, the fresh start he'd been waiting for. A new job, a new role, and a chance to prove himself. As he approached the nurse's station, a slim woman with graying hair glanced up from her paperwork. "You must be Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice polite but distant. "I'm Nurse Lisa Carter. Follow me and I'll show you to your office." "Nice to meet you, Nurse Carter," Marcus replied, offering a warm smile. But she turned away quickly, leading him down the hallway. Riverbend General was small compared to the bustling hospital where Marcus had worked in Chicago. The hallways were narrow, the walls painted a dull beige, and the whole place had a slightly dated feel. Yet as he passed staff members, he caught their curious stares. Their conversations abruptly stopped as he approached. Nurse Carter left him in a cramped office overlooking the parking lot. Marcus set down his briefcase, his fingers lingering on the family photo he placed on his desk. The faces of Rachel, Sarah, and Ethan smiled back at him, a reminder of why he was here. A knock sounded at the door. Marcus looked up to see Dr. David Roberts, the head of the hospital, stepping in with a practiced smile. "Welcome to Riverbend General, Dr. Bennett. We're glad to have you." "Thank you, Dr. Roberts," Marcus said, shaking his hand firmly. He noticed the slight hesitation before Dr. Roberts let go. "We'll have you shadow me for a few days just to get a feel for how we do things here," Dr. Roberts continued, glancing around the small office. "It's a bit different from the city, but I'm sure you'll adapt." Marcus nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the word different held a deeper meaning. While Marcus settled into the hospital, Rachel focused on helping the kids adjust to their new school. At Riverbend Elementary, she met with Mrs. Campbell, Sarah's fourth-grade teacher, and Mr. Morris, Ethan's second-grade teacher. They exchanged pleasantries, but Rachel couldn't ignore the way their smiles tightened when they learned she was Marcus's wife. Outside the school, Rachel watched as Sarah and Ethan hesitated on the edge of the playground. A few kids eyed them curiously, but no one approached. Rachel's heart ached as she saw the uncertainty in her children's faces. "It'll be okay, kids," she said, kneeling down to adjust Ethan's collar. "You're going to make lots of friends here." Sarah nodded, though her expression was doubtful. "Why did that boy say we talk funny, Mom?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Well, honey, we just sound different because we're from a big city, but that's what makes us special." She kissed them both on the head before watching them join their new classmates, praying they wouldn't feel as out of place as she did. One afternoon, Rachel bumped into Evelyn Peterson at the grocery store. Evelyn offered a strained smile, her eyes darting to the other customers in the aisle. "I hear your husband is settling in at the hospital," Evelyn said casually as she reached for a can of soup. "He is," Rachel replied, trying to keep her tone light. "He's really looking forward to becoming part of the community." Evelyn hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Riverbend isn't like Chicago, Rachel. People here, they don't take well to change." Rachel stiffened. "What do you mean?" Evelyn glanced around, then shrugged. "Just keep an eye out, dear. Sometimes folks here hold on to old ways longer than they should." Rachel's mouth went dry. "Thanks for the advice, Evelyn." Evelyn nodded, then hurried away, leaving Rachel with a sense of foreboding that she couldn't quite place. Days passed and Marcus settled into the rhythm of the hospital. He worked late nights and early mornings, eager to show his dedication, but the unspoken distance from his colleagues remained. One evening, Marcus overheard a hushed conversation between two nurses. "I don't know why they brought him in from the city," one said, "and it's not like we need fancy credentials out here." "Well, doctor, Roberts says he's competent, but—" The other's voice trailed off when they noticed Marcus approaching. They offered a tight-lipped smile and quickly walked away. Marcus clenched his jaw but forced himself to focus on his work. He needed this job, needed to prove to everyone, including himself, that he belonged here. At home, Rachel put on a brave face, keeping their struggles from the kids. But Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes as she talked about the latest church event or PTA meeting that had gone awkwardly. It hurt to see her trying so hard without any real welcome in return. One Sunday, they took the kids to the town park. As Sarah and Ethan played on the swings, Marcus noticed how other parents gathered their children closer, subtly steering them away from the newcomers. Rachel slipped her hand into his, squeezing tightly. "It'll get better," she whispered, but he could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Marcus wrapped an arm around her, forcing a smile. Yeah, it will. We'll make it work. Yet as he watched their kids playing alone, while the other children kept their distance, the optimism he had clung to when they first arrived began to waver. Beneath the surface, Riverbend held something darker than the friendly welcome they had hoped for. And deep down, Marcus feared it was only a matter of time before that darkness found them. Marcus wiped a hand across his tired eyes as he glanced at the clock on the hospital wall. It was nearly midnight, and he was one of the last staff members left in the building. After finishing his final rounds, he grabbed his coat and walked out into the chilly night air, grateful for the peace and quiet. As he drove through the dimly lit streets of Riverbend, Marcus decided to stop at the small convenience store on the corner of Maple and Cedar. Rachel had asked him to pick up some milk, and he thought he might grab a snack for the ride home. The bell over the store door chimed as he stepped inside, and the clerk, a teenager he vaguely recognized from the high school, barely looked up from his phone. Marcus moved down the aisles, savoring the normalcy of the moment. He found the milk, grabbed a bag of chips, and was heading to the register when the glass front door suddenly shattered. Marcus spun around, dropping the milk. A masked figure stormed in, waving a handgun. The clerk screamed, dropping to the floor behind the counter, his hands over his head. The masked figure pointed the gun at the young clerk, his voice harsh and urgent. "Open the register! Now!" Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched behind the aisle, his mind racing. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew he had to do something to help the kid, but the fear kept him frozen in place. The clerk's hands shook violently as he fumbled with the register. Coins clattered to the floor, and the robber grew more agitated, waving the gun wildly. "Hurry up! Don't make me shoot you!" Marcus swallowed hard, gathering his courage. "Hey, let's all just stay calm," he called out, keeping his hands up as he slowly stepped into view. "Nobody wants to get hurt. Let him finish." The masked man turned toward Marcus, the gun now aimed directly at him. For a moment, time seemed to stretch out, the air thick with tension. Marcus kept his hands steady, trying to keep his voice calm. "Take the money and go, man. No one needs to get hurt tonight." The robber's eyes darted back to the clerk, then to Marcus, and finally he grabbed the cash the kid had managed to pull out. Shoving it into a bag, he backed toward the door, still keeping the gun trained on Marcus. And then he was gone, the bell above the door jingling mockingly in the silence that followed. Marcus exhaled sharply, rushing over to the clerk, who was visibly shaking. "You okay?" Marcus asked, checking for injuries. The boy nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I think so. Oh God, I thought he was going to kill me." "You're safe now. We need to call the police," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. As he dialed, he glanced at the shattered glass door, his heart still racing. He hoped the police would find the robber quickly. Within minutes, the wail of sirens echoed through the night, and red and blue lights flashed outside the store. Deputy Roy Collins stormed through the door with two other officers, their hands hovering near their holsters. Marcus raised his hands, trying to explain the situation. "He went that way," Marcus said, pointing toward the direction the robber had fled. "I'm a doctor. I was just—" "On the ground! Now!" Collins barked, pulling his gun. Marcus froze, shock and confusion paralyzing him. "Wait, no, I said on the ground!" Collins repeated, shoving Marcus to the floor. The cold linoleum pressed against Marcus's cheek as rough hands yanked his arms behind him, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The store clerk stood up shakily, his face pale. "It wasn't him. He was just—" "Stay back," another officer snapped, holding up a hand to the clerk. Collins yanked Marcus to his feet, ignoring his protests. "Please," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Check the cameras. I called 911. I was trying to help." Collins' jaw tightened as he pushed Marcus toward the squad car outside. "We'll sort it out downtown, Doc. Let's go." Inside the police station, Marcus found himself shoved into a cold, windowless interrogation room. His mind whirled as he tried to process what had just happened. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? He sat there for what felt like hours before the door creaked open, revealing Jack Holden, Riverbend's district attorney. Holden was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a slick demeanor and a reputation for being tough on crime. He settled into the chair across from Marcus, his eyes cold. "Dr. Bennett," Holden began, flipping through a thin file, "you claim you were just a bystander?" I wasn't just a bystander, Marcus replied, his voice raw with desperation. I was trying to keep the situation calm. I called 911. You can check my phone records. Holden's mouth twisted into a faint smirk. Yes, you called 911 after the robbery. Convenient, don't you think? Marcus's heart pounded. That's not true. You have to check the security footage. I'm a doctor. I have no reason to rob a store. Holden's smirk faded as he leaned forward, his voice taking on a menacing edge. Well, Doc, the store's camera was broken. The clerk was too scared to remember what he saw clearly, and you're the one they've found at the scene. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He knew how these things went. Without evidence, without witnesses willing to defend him, his word meant little in a town that already viewed him with suspicion. Please, just call my wife. She can explain everything. Holden cut him off with a dismissive wave. I think we both know that this isn't Chicago, Dr. Bennett. Around here, we value law and order. Marcus's mouth went dry as he realized how precarious his situation was. He was trapped in a nightmare, and no matter what he said, it seemed like no one would listen. Back at home, Rachel paced the living room, her mind racing. It was well past midnight, and she hadn't heard from Marcus. The kids were asleep, but her anxiety had kept her from bed. Finally, her phone rang, and she rushed to answer it. Rachel, it's Marcus. I'm at the police station. They arrested me. Rachel's heart dropped. What? Arrested you for what? They think I was involved in a robbery. I tried to explain, but... Marcus's voice cracked, and Rachel could hear the fear in it. I'll be there right away, she said, her voice trembling as she hung up. She called her neighbor Linda to come watch the kids, and then she raced to the police station, her mind a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. When she arrived, she found Marcus handcuffed to a bench, looking exhausted and defeated. She rushed to his side, but an officer held up a hand. You can't speak with him yet, ma'am. He's under investigation. This is a mistake, Rachel insisted, her voice rising. You can't just keep him here. He didn't do anything. Holden stepped into the room, his expression tight with irritation. Mrs. Bennett, I understand this is difficult, but we have reason to believe your husband was involved in the robbery. Rachel stared at him, her hands trembling. Reason? What reason? He's a doctor. He's not a criminal. But Holden's face remained impassive. We'll know more after we conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime, Dr. Bennett will remain in custody. Rachel's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. She reached out to Marcus, her fingers brushing his arm. We'll get through this, Marcus. I'll find a lawyer, someone who can help us. Marcus nodded, but the fear in his eyes broke her heart. Take care of the kids, Rachel. Make sure they're okay. She bit back her sobs and squeezed his hand one last time before he was led away, leaving her standing alone in the harsh fluorescent light of the police station. The news of Marcus Bennett's arrest spread through Riverbend like wildfire. By morning, the town's rumor mill was in full swing, and nearly everyone had heard about the doctor-turned-robber. Whispers and sideways glances followed Rachel as she walked the kids to school. At the grocery store, she overheard two women talking near the produce section. I knew there was something off about them, one woman said, her voice low. City folks think they can just come in and do whatever they want. Rachel's face burned with shame and anger, but she kept her head high, forcing herself to keep moving. She couldn't afford to break down, not when her children needed her to stay strong. Ethan clung to her side, his small hand clutching hers tightly. When is Daddy coming home? He asked, his voice trembling. Soon, sweetie, Rachel lied, her chest aching. It's just a big misunderstanding. But as the days passed, she found herself facing rejection after rejection from local lawyers. No one wanted to take on a case against the town's beloved district attorney. Even neighbors who had once been friendly now averted their eyes when they saw her coming. At home, Sarah and Ethan grew more withdrawn, their cheerful chatter replaced by quiet, worried questions. At night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the silent phone, praying for a miracle. Jack Holden sat behind his polished mahogany desk, reading the latest police report. He drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair, his mind racing. The evidence against Marcus Bennett was thin, practically non-existent, but the town was scared. People wanted a resolution, and they wanted someone to blame. Jack knew that prosecuting Marcus would secure his position as a tough district attorney in the eyes of Riverbend. It would keep the town's more conservative residents on his side, especially those who were uneasy about a black doctor from the city setting up shop in their town. Besides, he muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair, it's not like he's got any friends here. He told himself that he was doing what needed to be done, that it was his job to keep the town safe. But as he drafted the charges, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he might be making a terrible mistake. Jack silenced that voice, focusing instead on the praise he'd received for being tough on crime. As he prepared to announce the charges against Marcus Bennett, he couldn't have imagined how deeply the consequences of this decision would ripple through their small town and through his own life. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as the trial of Dr. Marcus Bennett began. Townspeople packed into the courtroom, their curiosity mixed with thinly veiled suspicion. Marcus sat at the defense table, his suit pressed but his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Rachel sat behind him, clutching a tissue, her gaze unwavering as she tried to stay strong for him. Marcus's lawyer, Carl Anderson, was a wiry man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a furrowed brow. He had taken the case reluctantly after Rachel's desperate plea, but it was clear he wasn't used to high-profile trials. His voice wavered as he delivered his opening statement, struggling to counter the more charismatic and assertive Jack Holden. Holden rose to speak, his presence commanding. He paced in front of the jury, painting Marcus as a dangerous outsider who had taken advantage of Riverbend's trust. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Holden began, his voice smooth and confident. "This man, Marcus Bennett, came to our town claiming to be a doctor, a healer, but when he thought no one was looking, he revealed his true nature." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table. He wanted to shout, to tell the jury that this was all wrong, but he stayed silent, knowing that his fate now lay in the hands of 12 people who barely knew him. As the trial progressed, Carl attempted to introduce evidence of Marcus's innocence. He showed the 911 call Marcus had made, emphasizing that it was proof he was trying to help. He called Eric, the young store clerk, to the stand, hoping his testimony would sway the jury. Eric fidgeted under the harsh courtroom lights, glancing nervously at the jury. "Doctor, Bennett didn't do anything," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. He was trying to calm the robber down." Holden stepped forward, his tone patronizing. "Eric, isn't it true that you were terrified that night? That your memory might not be entirely clear?" Eric hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I guess. But I know he didn't." "Thank you, Eric," Holden interrupted, effectively dismissing him. He turned back to the jury, shaking his head slightly, as if to say that Eric's testimony couldn't be trusted. The defense's case crumbled further when Holden emphasized the broken surveillance camera, suggesting that it was just too convenient that the footage had been lost. He called Deputy Roy Collins to the stand, who testified that Marcus had been acting suspiciously when they arrived. Rachel watched helplessly from the gallery, tears stinging her eyes as each piece of the prosecution's case seemed to carry more weight than the truth. She reached for Marcus's hand during a break, trying to convey her love and support. "We'll get through this," she whispered, though her voice wavered. Marcus squeezed her hand but couldn't bring himself to respond. He could feel hope slipping away with each passing hour. The trial stretched on for days, but the outcome seemed clear from the beginning. The jury, made up mostly of longtime Riverbend residents, exchanged knowing glances as witnesses spoke about their gut feelings that something was off about Marcus. Finally, after closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom was thick with tension as everyone waited for the verdict. Marcus stared at his hands, trying to focus on his breathing, trying to believe that the truth would prevail. But when the jury returned, the foreman's face was expressionless as he stood to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Marcus Bennett, guilty of armed robbery." Rachel let out a choked sob, clutching her stomach as if the words had struck her physically. Marcus felt the floor drop out from beneath him, his mind struggling to process what he just heard. His ears rang, drowning out the judge's voice as he pronounced the sentence. "Dr. Marcus Bennett, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison." Marcus turned to Rachel, his vision blurring with unshed tears. She reached out, grabbing his hand through the bars of the court bench, her face contorted with anguish. Their children, Sarah and Ethan, clung to each other, their faces pale with confusion and fear. "I love you, Rachel," Marcus managed to say, his voice cracking. "Take care of them." Before he could say more, the bailiff pulled him away, leading him out of the courtroom. Rachel collapsed into her seat, her body racked with sobs as she watched the love of her life disappear behind the heavy wooden doors. The steel gates of Crescent Ridge State Prison clanged shut behind Marcus, sealing him into a world he'd never imagined. The cold, sterile hallways and the constant noise of shouting inmates and clanging bars assaulted his senses. Marcus was issued an orange jumpsuit, and his few personal belongings were locked away in a small box labeled with his inmate number. In the prison yard, Marcus kept his head down, avoiding the gangs that claimed territory in different corners. He spent most of his time in the library or the infirmary, trying to keep to himself. But the weight of his unjust conviction pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Nights were the worst. Lying on the hard cot in his tiny cell, Marcus stared at the cracked ceiling, replaying the trial over and over in his mind. He whispered the names of his children like a mantra, trying to hold on to some piece of hope. Sarah, Ethan, I'll be home. I'll be home. But deep down, a part of him feared he would never get that chance. One afternoon, Marcus was assigned to work in the prison's infirmary. He kept to himself, sweeping floors and organizing supplies. But then a fellow inmate, Leo, doubled over in pain, clutching his side. The prison's physician, Dr. Howard, seemed dismissive, brushing it off as indigestion. "Excuse me," Marcus spoke up, stepping forward. "That could be appendicitis. He needs to be checked right away." Dr. Howard glared at him but reluctantly ordered tests. Hours later, Marcus was proven right. Leo was rushed into surgery and his life was saved. The incident quickly spread through the prison, earning Marcus a measure of respect from the inmates and even a grudging acknowledgement from the medical staff. After that, other inmates began seeking Marcus out for advice on minor injuries and illnesses. He couldn't officially practice medicine, but he could still offer guidance, still use his knowledge to help those around him. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small spark in the darkness. While Marcus adapted to life behind bars, Rachel faced a battle of her own on the outside. The bills piled up quickly, and with Marcus's salary gone, she was forced to take on extra shifts at the local diner. Her hands grew calloused, her nights long and sleepless as she tried to keep the household afloat. Sarah and Ethan grew quiet and withdrawn, struggling to make sense of their father's absence. Ethan refused to speak in class, while Sarah lashed out at her teachers and classmates. Rachel's heart broke a little more each time she found her son crying himself to sleep, clutching an old photo of Marcus. "Mommy, when is Daddy coming home?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice small and hesitant. Rachel knelt beside her daughter, brushing a stray curl from her face. "I don't know, sweetie, but I promise, I'm doing everything I can to bring him back." But each time she said those words, they felt like a lie. Rachel spent hours each night at the kitchen table, poring over law books and websites, trying to learn everything she could about the appeals process. She contacted legal aid groups, but they all turned her down. Linda Walker, her neighbor, tried to help where she could, but even Linda's connections weren't enough to make a difference. One evening, Rachel gathered the courage to call Martha Green, a lawyer she'd met through a church event. She held her breath as Martha answered the phone. "Martha, please, I'm calling about my husband's case. He's innocent. I just need someone to look into the evidence, to see what was missed." Martha's sigh crackled through the phone line. "I'm sorry, Rachel, but the case is too high profile, and I have to think about my practice. Best of luck to you." The line went dead, leaving Rachel to stare at the phone, tears brimming in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice that had stolen her husband away. But she couldn't afford to break down, not yet. Months passed, and Rachel's exhaustion grew deeper. She began receiving envelopes stamped with notice of eviction. She reached out to friends, to church members, even to the PTA mothers she'd once tried to befriend. But she found only polite refusals and cold shoulders. At home, Sarah and Ethan grew more restless. They fought with each other, with their mother, and with the world around them. Rachel struggled to keep their spirits up, telling them stories about their father and how he would come back one day. But on the darkest nights when the children were asleep, Rachel sat alone in the living room, staring at the family photo on the mantel. In those moments, she allowed herself to cry, letting the weight of everything she had lost pour out in silent, desperate sobs. She clung to Marcus's last words before he was taken away, his promise that they would find a way through this, that they would survive. And she repeated that promise to herself, even when it felt like her strength was slipping away. Months slipped by, blending into one another as the seasons changed. Marcus continued his work in the prison infirmary, finding a semblance of purpose in helping his fellow inmates. But at night, his thoughts always returned to Rachel, Sarah, and Ethan. He wondered how they were managing, whether they still believed he would come home. Meanwhile, in Riverbend, Jack Holden found his mind returning to the Bennett case with increasing frequency. He had told himself many times that he'd done his duty as a district attorney, that Marcus's conviction was justified, but he couldn't ignore the growing whispers around town, voices questioning whether the right man was behind bars. Jack's own home life had grown more complicated. His teenage son, Ryan, had been struggling with asthma for years, but lately the attacks have grown worse. One night, as Jack sat in his study reviewing case files, he heard his wife, Helen, shout from the living room, "Jack, it's Ryan, he can't breathe." Jack's heart leapt into his throat. He rushed into the room to find Ryan clutching his chest, his face pale and terrified as he struggled for air. Jack swept his son into his arms, trying to stay calm even as panic clawed at his chest. "We have to get him to the hospital, now!" Helen cried, her voice breaking. Jack sped through the dark streets of Riverbend, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. When they reached the emergency room, Jack shouted for help, but the understaffed hospital struggled to handle the influx of patients that night. Jack watched helplessly as nurses scrambled, trying to stabilize Ryan's breathing. He felt his own fear mirrored in his son's eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be powerless in the face of a crisis. As he sat beside Ryan's hospital bed, holding his son's hand, Jack's thoughts turned unbidden to Marcus Bennett. He remembered the look in Marcus's eyes when he had delivered the guilty verdict, how it mirrored the same fear and desperation he felt now. Helen approached, her face lined with worry. "Jack, do you think there's a chance that Marcus was telling the truth about what happened that night?" Jack shook his head, but doubt gnawed at him. "I don't know, Helen. I just don't know." The next morning, Jack found himself pacing in his office, unable to focus. He knew the town still supported his decision, but he couldn't shake the nagging doubts that had begun to plague him. He sat down and pulled up the old case file, flipping through the notes and photos. His eyes lingered on the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. The broken security camera, the lack of reliable witnesses, the store clerk's testimony, uncertain and afraid. For the first time, Jack admitted to himself that he might have overlooked key details in his rush to secure a conviction. Determined to find answers, Jack visited the Riverbend Police Department. Deputy Collins looked up, surprised to see the district attorney there without an appointment. "Mr. Holden, what brings you here?" "I need to see the evidence from the Bennett case," Jack said, keeping his tone even. "All of it, including the recovered surveillance footage." Collins hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "That footage was pretty grainy. I didn't think it'd be much help." "I'll decide that for myself," Jack replied, his voice steely. He watched the footage in the department's back room, his hands trembling as he hit play. The image was blurry, but he could make out Marcus's silhouette, his hands raised, his body language non-threatening, as he tried to calm the situation. Jack's chest tightened as he realized that Marcus's actions matched his story perfectly. He sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. The implications of his mistake weighed heavily on him, but he knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Jack's mind churned as he left the police station, a plan forming. He couldn't undo the conviction alone. He needed help. After years of thinking only about his career, he finally saw the true cost of his ambition. But he knew that seeking justice for Marcus would require swallowing his pride and risking his reputation. The next morning, he stood outside Rachel Bennett's small house, his hands shaking slightly as he knocked on the door. Rachel answered, her face pale and drawn. The dark circles under her eyes told of sleepless nights and unrelenting worry. "What do you want, Mr. Holden?" she asked, her voice flat with exhaustion. Jack took a deep breath. "Rachel, I think I made a mistake. I've been looking over the evidence, and I believe your husband might be innocent. I want to help you reopen his case." Rachel's mouth fell open, and for a moment she seemed too stunned to respond. Then her expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Why should I trust you? You're the reason he's in prison." Jack nodded, the shame clear in his eyes. "You're right. I was wrong, and I can't take that back. But I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make this right. Will you give me a chance?" Rachel studied him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of deceit. After a long silence, she stepped aside, letting him into the living room. "All right, but if you're lying, I'll fight you every step of the way." Jack nodded, grateful for the small crack in her resolve. "I understand." Over the following weeks, Jack and Rachel worked tirelessly, submitting a petition for a retrial. They pored over the old transcripts, gathering evidence that had been ignored the first time. Jack filed a formal request with the state to review the new surveillance footage, hoping it would be enough to convince a judge to reopen the case. Rachel's neighbor, Linda Walker, joined their efforts, using her connections to spread word about the potential miscarriage of justice. Slowly, some of Riverbend's residents began to reconsider their assumptions about Marcus. At the same time, Marcus received a letter from Rachel detailing what was happening. As he read her words, a cautious hope began to bloom in his chest, a hope he had nearly forgotten how to feel. Rachel's letter concluded with a simple but powerful message. "Don't give up, Marcus. We're getting closer to the truth." Marcus clutched the letter to his chest, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in years. Months later, a judge finally granted Marcus a new hearing based on the new evidence. Rachel and Jack sat side by side in the courtroom as the judge reviewed the recovered footage and heard testimony from new witnesses, including Eric, who spoke more confidently about what he remembered that night. The courtroom was tense as the judge delivered his decision. Based on the evidence presented, it is the court's decision that the previous conviction of Marcus Bennett is overturned, and he is hereby released. Marcus's legs nearly gave out as the handcuffs were removed. He turned to see Rachel rushing toward him, her face streaked with tears. He gathered her into his arms, his own tears spilling over as he held her close. "I told you I'd bring you home," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Marcus nodded, unable to find words. He turned to look at Jack, who stood silently at the back of the courtroom, his expression somber. Marcus inclined his head in a gesture of acknowledgement, knowing that while he wasn't ready to forgive, he could at least recognize Jack's role in righting this wrong. The drive back to Riverbend was quiet, filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. As they pulled into the driveway of their old home, Marcus saw Sarah and Ethan standing on the porch, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was small, barely more than a whisper. Marcus knelt down, his arms open wide. "Come here, both of you." The children rushed forward, burying their faces in his chest as he hugged them tightly. For a moment, everything felt whole again. But as he pulled back, he saw the uncertainty lingering in their eyes, the shadows that hadn't been there before. As they walked into the house, Marcus noticed how much had changed. The furniture was worn, and the walls were bare where family photos had once hung. Rachel caught his glance and squeezed his hand. "We've been through a lot," she said softly, "but we'll get through this too. Together." Marcus nodded, a lump forming in his throat. But as he looked at the faces of his family, he felt a renewed determination to rebuild the life they'd lost. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight for it. Marcus knew that returning to a normal life would be a long and difficult journey. The hospital where he'd once worked refused to take him back, citing concerns about his record. Even after his exoneration, the stain of the conviction lingered, affecting every job application, every interaction in town. But Marcus refused to let the setbacks defeat him. He used his savings to rent a small office space in the heart of Riverbend, hoping to open a community health clinic for the town's underserved residents. He hung a simple sign outside, "Dr. Marcus Bennett, free consultations." On the first day, only a few patients trickled in, mostly people who couldn't afford care elsewhere. but Marcus welcomed each one with the same warmth and dedication he'd always brought to his work. Jack visited the clinic one evening, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I heard you opened this place," he said quietly. "It's, good to see you back at it, Marcus." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Jack." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Marcus's clinic, though small, became a refuge for those in Riverbend who had nowhere else to turn. He worked long hours, treating everything from routine checkups to more serious cases, his office slowly gaining a reputation among the town's marginalized residents. He treated patients without judgment, understanding all too well the feeling of being on the outside looking in. Yet despite his dedication, Marcus struggled financially. Many of his patients couldn't afford to pay, and his savings dwindled quickly. The town's whispers hadn't entirely died down either. People still looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, and local businesses often treated him with a coldness he couldn't quite shake. One evening, after closing the clinic, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at a pile of unpaid bills. Rachel entered the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said softly. But Marcus could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the weariness that matched his own. He reached up to cover her hand with his. "I'm not giving up," he said, though the words felt heavy. "I just wish it wasn't so hard." Rachel knelt beside him, looking into his eyes. "You're doing good work, Marcus. Real work. People are starting to see who you really are." Marcus nodded, trying to absorb her reassurance. But deep down, a part of him wondered if he would ever truly belong in this town that had once turned its back on him. While Marcus fought to rebuild his life, Jack Holden faced his own challenges. The fallout from his public admission of wrongdoing had shaken his standing in Riverbend. He had been suspended from his position as district attorney for 6 months, and many of his old allies now kept their distance, their respect for him tarnished by his admission of error. As part of his suspension, Jack was required to volunteer at the community health center where Marcus now worked. The first day he walked through the clinic's doors, he felt a knot of anxiety twist in his chest. He spotted Marcus across the room, talking softly to a young mother holding a feverish baby. For a moment, Jack considered turning around and leaving, but then he took a deep breath and walked over, offering a tentative nod. "Marcus, I'm here to help out." Marcus looked at him, his expression unreadable, then nodded back. "We can use the help. There's always more to do than time allows." Their interactions were stiff at first, the weight of their shared history lingering in the air. But over the next few weeks, a tentative working relationship began to form. Jack sorted medical supplies, helped patients fill out forms, and watched as Marcus treated each person with compassion that never wavered, no matter how tired he seemed. One evening, as they were closing up the clinic, Jack finally spoke up. "Marcus, I know it doesn't change what I did, but I'm sorry. I've been trying to make things right, but I know I can't ever truly undo what happened." Marcus paused, his hands stilling over the papers on his desk. He looked at Jack, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and let out a slow breath. "You're right, Jack. It doesn't change what happened, but I see that you're trying." The words were simple, but Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was more than he thought he deserved. Just as Marcus began to regain a foothold in Riverbend, a new challenge struck. A severe flu outbreak swept through the town, filling the small hospital beyond capacity. People lined up outside Marcus's clinic, seeking help when the overwhelmed hospital could not accommodate them. Marcus and Rachel worked tirelessly, treating patients well into the night. They set up costs in the waiting room and triaged the most critical cases, doing everything they could to keep up with the demand. One afternoon, as Marcus was finishing with a patient, the clinic door burst open and Jack stumbled in, carrying his son Ryan in his arms. The teenager's face was flushed with fever, and his breathing was labored. "Marcus, please! Ryan's in bad shape," Jack gasped, his voice filled with panic. "The hospital couldn't take him. I didn't know where else to go." For a split second, Marcus froze, the memories of his wrongful conviction and everything Jack had done to him rushing back. But then his medical instincts took over, and he motioned for Jack to bring Ryan into the exam room. "Get him on the bed," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. "I'll get an IV started. Rachel, we need cool compresses and oxygen. Now." Jack hovered anxiously at Ryan's side, his hands shaking as he watched Marcus work. Rachel rushed in with supplies, and they worked together to stabilize Ryan's breathing. Marcus's focus was intense, his movements efficient and precise as he administered fluids and checked the boy's vitals. Slowly, Ryan's breathing steadied, and his fever began to break. Jack sagged against the wall, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son's condition improve. He looked at Marcus, a mixture of relief and raw emotion in his eyes. "Thank you," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve your help, but you saved my son's life." Marcus met his gaze, the weight of their history hanging between them. He let out a long breath, feeling some of the bitterness that had lived inside him for years began to lift. "Like I told you before, Jack, I took an oath to help those in need. That's what I'm here for." News of Marcus's work during the outbreak spread quickly through Riverbend. People who had once viewed him with suspicion began to see him in a new light, realizing that he was not only a skilled physician, but a man of integrity. As the flu crisis subsided, families who had been treated at Marcus's clinic returned with small gifts: baked goods, handmade cards from children, even potted plants to brighten the clinic's waiting room. Evelyn Peterson, who had once been distant, brought him a basket of fresh produce from her garden. "I'm sorry, Dr. Bennett," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion, "for the way I treated you and your family when you first came here. You've shown this town what real kindness looks like." Marcus nodded, accepting the gesture, though a part of him still struggled to forgive. But he could see that Riverbend was beginning to change, to confront the biases that had once led them astray. As the crisis passed and the town settled into a new normal, Jack approached Marcus with a surprising offer. "The hospital board is looking for new members," he said one evening, as they finished cleaning up the clinic. "I know it's a long shot, but I think you should apply. We need voices like yours to make sure something like what happened never happens again." Marcus studied Jack's face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. He thought of all he had lost: the career, the trust, the years with his family. He thought of the patients who had come to his clinic, people who had been overlooked and underserved. Finally, he nodded. "I'll consider it, Jack. But if I'm going to join that board, it's because I want to change things, not to smooth over anyone's conscience." Jack nodded, accepting Marcus's words. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The town of Riverbend held a community meeting at the high school auditorium, a chance for residents to voice their concerns about the flu outbreak, the state of the local healthcare system, and the future of the town. Marcus attended, sitting quietly at the back of the room, listening as people spoke about their experiences during the crisis. When Jack Holden stood to address the crowd, the room fell silent. "I made mistakes," Jack said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I failed Marcus Bennett, and I failed this town by allowing fear and prejudice to guide my decisions. But I've seen the good this man has done since his return, and I believe we have a chance to build something better together." He turned to Marcus, gesturing for him to join him on stage. Marcus hesitated, then rose, feeling the eyes of the town on him as he walked to the front of the room. "I came to Riverbend hoping for a fresh start," Marcus said, his voice carrying through the auditorium. "But instead, I faced judgment and fear. I lost 3 years of my life, years I can never get back. But in these last few months, I've also seen this town start to change. And I believe that if we work together, we can build a community where no one else has to go through what I did." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, people in the audience began to applaud. It was tentative at first, but then it grew louder, a wave of clapping that filled the auditorium. Marcus stood on the stage, momentarily overwhelmed by the shift he felt in the room. He glanced at Jack beside him, who was clapping as well, his eyes shining with a mixture of relief and hope. Rachel, standing near the back with Sarah and Ethan, felt tears slip down her cheeks as she watched her husband speak. She squeezed their hands, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since moving to Riverbend, she believed they might truly belong. In the days following the community meeting, Marcus submitted his application for a position on the hospital board. To his surprise, the board approved his appointment, recognizing that his presence would bring a much-needed perspective to their decision-making. On his first day in his new role, Marcus walked into the boardroom feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known in a long time. He sat beside doctors and administrators who had once doubted him, ready to push for the changes. He believed Riverbend needed improvements in access to care, new programs for underserved families, and a focus on fairness and compassion. At home, Rachel and the children settled into a new rhythm. The shadow that had hung over their family for so long began to lift, replaced by a cautious but growing optimism. Sarah, who had struggled with making friends, finally joined a soccer team, where she found a few classmates who no longer looked at her as just the girl whose dad went to prison. Ethan became more confident. His laughter slowly returned to the house. As summer approached, Riverbend's annual community picnic took on new significance. It was no longer just a gathering. It had become a symbol of the town's effort to heal, to move past old divisions and embrace a future built on understanding. Marcus and Rachel worked with the town council to organize the event, setting up tents and preparing food with the help of volunteers. On the day of the picnic, the sun shone brightly, and the air was filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of children's laughter. Marcus manned the grill, flipping burgers as people lined up, many of them smiling and offering words of thanks for the work he had done during the flu outbreak. Rachel stood nearby, handing out plates and chatting with neighbors who had once looked at her with suspicion. Jack arrived with his family, carrying a large bowl of potato salad. He spotted Marcus at the grill and made his way over, offering a hand. "Need any help with those burgers?" Marcus glanced at him, then smiled, passing him a pair of tongs. "I think I could use a hand." They worked side by side, turning the meat and handing out food to hungry children and their parents. As they watched the crowd mingling, people of all backgrounds laughing and sharing stories, Jack turned to Marcus, his voice low but sincere. "You've done a lot for this town, Marcus. More than I ever did as prosecutor." Marcus shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's not about what we did back then, Jack. It's about what we do now, and what we do for the future." Jack nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he might truly be able to atone for his mistakes. As the afternoon went on, Marcus took a moment to step back from the crowd, watching as the people of Riverbend came together in a way he had never seen before. He saw Evelyn Peterson laughing with Rachel, and his children playing tag with kids from school, their shouts of joy carrying on the breeze. Jack joined him, leaning against the fence that bordered the picnic area. "You know, I never thought I'd see a day like this," he said quietly. It's beautiful." Marcus glanced at Jack, seeing the genuine emotion in his expression. "It is," he agreed, "but it's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do. For both of us." Jack nodded, accepting the challenge. "I'm ready to put in that work. For my son, and for this town." They stood together in companionable silence, watching as Riverbend came alive with the spirit of community they had both fought to rebuild. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the picnic, Marcus joined Rachel and the kids at a picnic table. They shared plates of food, the atmosphere light and relaxed in a way that felt almost foreign after everything they'd been through. Ethan leaned against his father, resting his head on Marcus's shoulder. "I'm glad you're home, Dad," he said softly, his voice filled with a childlike sincerity that brought a lump to Marcus's throat. Marcus wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him close. "Me too, buddy. Me too." Sarah looked up from her plate, a small, shy smile on her face. "And I'm glad we get to stay in Riverbend. It's not so bad here anymore." Rachel reached across the table, taking Marcus's hand in hers. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "I believe that now." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with a warmth that he had thought he might never feel again. He had lost so much, years of his life, the trust of his community, and the confidence he had once carried. But as he looked around at the people gathered at the picnic, on the way Riverbend had begun to open its heart to him and his family, He realized that they had gained something even more valuable, a chance to start over, to build a better future together. He glanced over at Jack, who was helping Ryan and the other kids set up a game of soccer on the grass. Because of all the pain and anger he had carried, Marcus found himself letting go, bit by bit. The past could not be undone, but perhaps with time, he could find a way to forgive. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, he allowed himself to believe that, after all the darkness they had faced, there was light ahead. After the community picnic, life in Riverbend began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Marcus's clinic, which had once struggled to stay afloat, now saw a steady stream of patients from all walks of life, many of whom had once been wary of seeking his help. People brought their children in for checkups, sought his advice on managing chronic illnesses, and even asked for his opinion on town health initiatives. With Marcus on the hospital board, he pushed for changes that focused on equity and access to care, working with fellow members to establish new programs that provided low-cost health services to families in need. It was slow work, but Marcus felt a sense of purpose with each step forward. Meanwhile, Jack continued to volunteer at the clinic even after his suspension ended, becoming a regular presence among the staff. He organized free legal advice sessions for low-income families, offering help with everything from housing disputes to understanding healthcare rights. He knew he could never truly make up for what he'd done, but he was determined to dedicate his time to supporting those he had once overlooked. One afternoon, after a long board meeting, Marcus found himself walking through Riverbend's main street. He paused outside the diner where Rachel had once worked double shifts to keep their family afloat. The memory stirred something inside him, a bittersweet mix of gratitude and loss. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling. The owner, Marty, looked up in surprise as Marcus approached the counter. "Doc, good to see you," Marty said, wiping his hands on a dishcloth. There was a hint of uncertainty in his voice, as if he wasn't quite sure how to act. Marcus smiled faintly, taking a seat on one of the stools. "Thought I'd drop by. I heard you were organizing a fundraiser for the clinic's new children's program." Marty's face brightened and he nodded eagerly. "Yeah, we're hosting a community breakfast next week. I figured it was the least we could do after, well, you know." Marcus met his gaze, seeing the unspoken apology there. He nodded slowly, allowing a small smile to play on his lips. "Thanks, Marty. It means a lot." Marty seemed relieved, and for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of genuine connection with the town he had once viewed as an unwelcoming place. He realized that while scars would always remain, Riverbend was beginning to find its way forward. A few weeks later, Riverbend's town council held a special meeting, inviting community members to discuss how the town could address past injustices and foster a more inclusive environment. Marcus attended, standing at the back of the town hall with Rachel by his side. The council opened the floor for comments, and at first the room was filled with nervous silence. Then Evelyn Peterson stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched a folded piece of paper. "I've lived in Riverbend my whole life," Evelyn began, her voice trembling. "And I've seen this town change, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. But I know that when Marcus Bennett and his family came here, we didn't treat them right. We let fear guide our actions, and we turned our backs when they needed us most." She looked directly at Marcus, her eyes misty with unshed tears. "Dr. Bennett, I'm sorry. I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I'm proud to call you my doctor, and I hope that one day you might call me a friend." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and a few other residents stood to share their own regrets. Some spoke about how they had doubted Marcus without ever giving him a chance, while others admitted that they had been too afraid to stand up for what was right. As Marcus listened, he felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for support, anger at the years lost, and a deep, abiding sadness for all the pain his family had endured. But there was hope too, a hope that this willingness to confront hard truths might help heal the rifts that had once divided them. When the floor opened for more comments, Rachel hesitated, but then she squeezed Marcus's hand and stood up. The room quieted as she faced the audience, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. 3 years ago, when my husband was arrested, I thought I'd lost everything, she began. I thought I'd lost the life we'd built together, and that Riverbend would never see Marcus for the man he truly is, a kind, hard-working father, husband, and doctor. She paused, her voice wavering slightly. But in the end, we didn't lose everything. We found people who believed in us, who fought for justice even when it was hard. And we learned that while forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it can build a bridge to a better future. Rachel looked out at the faces of their neighbors, many of whom had once turned away when she asked for help. I'm grateful for those of you who have opened your hearts to us, and I hope that this town can become a place where no one has to feel like an outsider. Marcus reached out, taking her hand as she finished speaking. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, and for the first time, Marcus felt that Riverbend might truly become the home they had hoped for. After the meeting, Marcus stepped outside into the cool evening air, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. Jack found him standing alone beneath the town hall's old oak tree, his hands in his pockets. That was a powerful thing Rachel said in there, Jack remarked, leaning against the tree trunk. She's stronger than I ever gave her credit for. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the lights of the town square. She kept us together when I couldn't. I owe her everything. Jack looked down, scuffing his shoe against the dirt. Marcus, I want you to know that I'm resigning from my position as district attorney. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I realize that I can't keep being the face of justice in this town, not after what I did to you. Marcus turned to face Jack, surprise flickering in his expression. You don't have to do that, Jack. I know you've been trying to make things right. Jack shook his head. It's not enough. I made a decision based on prejudice and fear, and I need to take responsibility for that. I think this town needs a fresh start, just like you and I did. Marcus studied Jack for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're doing the right thing, Jack. And for what it's worth, I believe you've changed. Jack swallowed hard, emotion welling in his eyes. Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know. The following week, Jack announced his resignation in a public statement, expressing his regret over the mistakes he had made and his hope that Riverbend would continue on its path toward healing. While some in the town were critical, others appreciated his honesty, and many saw it as a necessary step in the town's journey toward accountability. As Jack stepped down, Marcus continued his work on the hospital board, advocating for programs that address the needs of the town's most vulnerable residents. He began giving talks at the local high school, speaking to students about the importance of empathy, understanding, and the dangers of rushing to judgment. Rachel joined him at these events, sharing her story as a way to inspire others to stand up against injustice. Together, they found a new sense of purpose, using their experiences to help build a community that valued fairness and inclusion. In time, Jack found his own path forward. He opened a small legal practice, offering pro bono services to those who needed help navigating the system. It wasn't the prestigious role he once held, but it was work that gave him a sense of fulfillment and redemption. And while the road to forgiveness was long and uncertain, Jack and Marcus found themselves sharing quiet conversations over coffee at the local diner, discussing everything from the latest town news to their hopes for the future. As autumn settled over Riverbend, Marcus walked the path leading to the town's old church, where a new community event was being held, a day of remembrance for those who had faced injustice and hardship in Riverbend's history. He watched as families gathered to share stories, some of them recounting the town's less proud moments, others speaking of the kindnesses that had helped them through difficult times. Rachel stood by his side, her arm linked through his, and the children ran ahead to join their friends in the churchyard. The air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves, and the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the ground. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had endured. He knew that not every wound had healed, and that some scars would remain. But as he watched the people of Riverbend, people who had once feared him, now embracing him as a part of their community, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't thought possible. Jack approached, carrying a tray of cider, and handed one to Marcus with a tentative smile. Here's to new beginnings, he said, raising his cup. Marcus clinked his cup against Jack's, a small smile playing on his lips. To new beginnings. They sipped their drinks in silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. And in that quiet moment, beneath the fading light, Marcus allowed himself to believe that, after all the darkness, they had found their way back to the light. Winter came to Riverbend, transforming the town into a landscape of snow-dusted rooftops and icicle-lined streets. Marcus's clinic, which had once struggled to attract patients, was now bustling with activity. The community had come to appreciate his dedication, and his waiting room often overflowed with families seeking his care. On one particularly cold morning, Marcus arrived at the clinic to find Mrs. Miller, an elderly woman he had treated during the flu outbreak, waiting outside with a steaming thermos in her hands. "Thought you could use some hot cocoa, Doc," she said, offering him a warm smile. Marcus accepted the thermos with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I appreciate it." She patted his arm, her eyes twinkling. "You've done more for this town than you'll ever know, Marcus. Don't forget that." As she shuffled away, Marcus took a moment to look around at the town square, watching as people hurried along the snow-covered sidewalks. He no longer felt like a stranger in Riverbend. He felt like he was part of the fabric of the town, woven into its changing story. He thought of Rachel and the kids who had found their own places here. Sarah's soccer team had won the regional championship, and Ethan had joined the school chess club, surprising everyone with his quick mind and strategic thinking. Marcus knew that their new lives hadn't erased the pain of the past, but it had given them something to hope for, a future built on understanding and resilience. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, Marcus found a letter in his mailbox from St. Matthew's Hospital in Chicago, the same hospital where he had once worked. He opened it slowly, his heart racing with a mix of curiosity and dread. "Dear Dr. Bennett, we are writing to express our deepest apologies for the role our institution played in failing to support you during your wrongful conviction. It has come to our attention that your medical license has been reinstated, and we would like to extend an offer for you to return as a visiting physician should you wish to rejoin our team." Marcus read the letter twice, feeling a surge of emotions: bitterness, pride, relief. He had once dreamed of returning to his old life, of reclaiming the status and recognition he had lost. But now, as he thought of the work he was doing in Riverbend, of the people who depended on him here, he realized that he no longer needed the validation of his past. That night, as he shared the news with Rachel, she squeezed his hand. "What do you think you'll do?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. Marcus smiled softly. His decision was already clear in his mind. "I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be." Rachel kissed him, her expression warm with pride. "I think so too, Marcus. I really do." Jack Holden, too, found himself on a new path. After resigning as district attorney, he had thrown himself into his pro bono legal work, helping those who had been caught in the same system that had once wrongly convicted Marcus. He focused on cases involving wrongful eviction, immigration, and criminal records, working alongside a younger attorney named Derek Nguyen, who shared his passion for justice. One snowy afternoon, Jack visited Marcus at the clinic, carrying a folder under his arm. He knocked on the doorframe, smiling as Marcus looked up from his paperwork. "Thought I'd drop by with some updates on that patient assistance program you've been pushing for," Jack said, handing over the documents. Marcus took the folder, flipping through the pages. "Thanks, Jack. This could make a big difference for a lot of families here." Jack hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Listen, Marcus. I've been thinking about starting a new initiative, a community justice project, focusing on reviewing old cases in this area, making sure there aren't any more mistakes like the one I made with you. I was hoping you'd consider being on the advisory board." Marcus looked up, studying Jack's expression. He saw the same determination that had once made him such a formidable opponent in court, but now it was softened with humility and a genuine desire to make things right. "I'll think about it," Marcus said, his lips curving into a small smile. "It might be nice to make sure no one else goes through what I did." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Marcus. It means a lot." They shook hands, and as Jack left the clinic, he felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly on the right path. As the holidays approached, Riverbend was transformed by twinkling lights and festive decorations. Marcus and Rachel hosted a small gathering at their home, inviting a few neighbors, Jack and his family, and some of the patients Marcus had helped throughout the year. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, the warmth of the fireplace mingling with the scent of freshly baked cookies. Marcus watched as Sarah and Ethan played a board game with Jack's son Ryan, the tension between the families now a distant memory. Rachel caught Marcus's eye from across the room, and he walked over to her, wrapping an arm around her waist as they watched the children together. "You know, I never thought we'd see a day like this," Rachel said softly, leaning into him. Marcus pressed a kiss to her temple. "Neither did I, but I'm glad we're here." They stood together in the glow of the Christmas tree, the house filled with the joyful noise of a new chapter unfolding. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to simply be grateful for the love of his family, for the support of his community, and for the second chance that had allowed him to find peace. As winter gave way to spring, Riverbend blossomed with new life. The town square, once a place of whispered rumors, now hosted farmers' markets and community festivals. Events where Marcus and Rachel felt like true members of the community. One sunny afternoon, Marcus received a visit from Evelyn Peterson, who walked into the clinic with a bouquet of wildflowers in her arms. "These are for you and Rachel," Evelyn said, her smile shy but genuine. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for Riverbend. It's a better place because of you." Marcus accepted the flowers, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you, Evelyn. That means more than you know." As Evelyn left, Marcus placed the bouquet in a vase on the reception desk, the bright colors a reminder of how far they had all come. He looked around the clinic at the worn waiting room chairs, the shelves lined with medical supplies, and the photographs of patients who had become more than just names in his charts. He realized that this place, this small, humble clinic, had become more than just a workplace. It was a symbol of everything he and Rachel had fought for, a place where people could find care, acceptance, and a second chance. Riverbend's annual spring festival drew a crowd to the town square, with food stalls, live music, and children's games. Marcus and Rachel stood side by side at a booth, offering free health screenings to anyone who stopped by. Jack and Derek manned the booth next door, handing out pamphlets about the Community Justice Project. Jack caught Marcus's eye and raised a glass of lemonade in a silent toast, and Marcus returned the gesture with a smile. As the day went on, more and more people stopped by, not just for the services, but to chat with Marcus and Rachel, to share stories and laughter. The tension that had once defined their interactions with the town was gone, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. Toward the end of the day, Marty, the diner owner, took the stage at the town's gazebo and called for everyone's attention. "I just wanted to say a few words," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This year has been a tough one, but it's also been a year of change. And I think we owe a lot of that to Marcus Bennett and his family. They showed us what it means to keep fighting, even when things seem hopeless. And I think we're all better for it." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus felt Rachel squeeze his hand, her eyes shining with pride. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing not strangers, but neighbors, people who had learned, like he had, that redemption and healing were possible, even after the darkest of times. That evening, as the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the rooftops, Marcus, Rachel, and their children returned home. They sat on the porch enjoying the cool breeze and the sound of crickets chirping in the dusk. Ethan leaned his head against Marcus's shoulder, while Sarah rested her feet on the porch railing, her face turned up to the sky. Rachel sat beside Marcus, her hand in his, the silence between them filled with a deep, contented peace. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Rachel murmured, her voice carrying a note of wonder. Marcus nodded, squeezing her hand. "We have, and I think we're finally home." Rachel turned to look at him, a smile playing on her lips. "You know, I never stopped believing we'd get here, even when it felt impossible." Marcus kissed her cheek, feeling a sense of gratitude swell within him. "I know, and you're the reason I never gave up, Rachel. You and the kids." As they sat together, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Marcus knew that their journey hadn't been easy. They had faced pain, loss, and injustice, but they had also found strength, love, and a community willing to grow and change. And as he looked out at the town he had once feared would never accept him, he realized that the future held something he had almost forgotten how to hope for. A chance to build a life not defined by the past, but by the possibilities of what lay ahead. As Marcus, Rachel, and their children sat together on their porch, watching the fireflies dance in the warm evening air, they knew that this was just the beginning of their new chapter in Riverbend, a chapter built on hope, resilience, and the belief that change is always possible. If you were moved by Marcus's journey, and if you believe in the power of second chances, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of the strength in all of us. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that matter, stories that show that even in the darkest times, hope can shine through. Click that subscribe button and join our community. You won't want to miss the next story that will touch your heart just like this one.